Hi everyone. Today we're going to be talking about cultural change. We've already discussed how culture is adaptive. It changes in order to deal with the real-time circumstances of the people who live in that society or culture. Today I want to talk about how cultural change happens, as well as different types of cultural change, both internal and external cultural change. Cultures change for a variety of reasons, such as environmental change, technological change, etc. But one of the big causes of cultural change is culture contact. When cultures come in contact with each other, there's a sharing of ideas, a sharing of material culture, food, clothing, technologies, political ideas, philosophy, religions. All of that changes when cultures come in contact with each other. Sometimes, when two cultures come into contact with each other, syncretism occurs. Syncretism is a cultural process where, when cultures collide, the members of those societies pick and choose certain aspects of new cultures and bring them into their worldview. For example, I've already talked about my experiences looking at Dia de los Muertos in Mexico. There's an example of a syncretic religious practice. It's a mix of both the Catholic Church and also indigenous Mayan beliefs about what happens after one dies. So there's an example of syncretism. Cultural change also occurs when you see cultural contact of immigrants coming from one society and moving into another society with a different culture. There are two different ways to think about the immigrant experience when it comes to cultural change, and I want to differentiate between them. There's assimilation and acculturation. Assimilation is the idea that a minority group or an incoming immigrant group should be accepted by the hegemonic population, and in exchange, that group takes on the culture or the beliefs of that hegemonic group. So, for example, if you're an American that says, yes, immigrants can come from other countries, but when they come here, they have to learn to speak English and they have to learn to act American. They need to do American things, eat American foods, dress in American clothes. That's part of the condition of being an American. If that's your belief, then you believe in assimilation. One country that really emphasizes the assimilation model is France. France says, look, if France controlled your colonial state back in the day, you're free to come to France and become a French citizen. But you need to become French. You need to speak French. You need to change your religion and become the dominant religion of France, which is Catholicism or Protestant Christianity, one of the two. You need to dress appropriately for French style. You need to eat French food, etc., etc. That's part of the social contract of being French. This leads to a lot of conflict in France over the issue of the hijab or headscarf. There are lots of Muslim women who move to France and are concerned about laws that require them to take the headscarf off in public places. This is because the French believe in assimilation. If you come to France, you need to assimilate, and that means no longer wearing the headscarf. Assimilation is a very contested issue in politics today. Acculturation is a different process. This is a cultural process where new groups or minorities live within a dominant or hegemonic culture, but they still maintain their own unique cultural identity. Sometimes acculturation is also thought of as hyphenated identities, so you're Irish American or you're Indian American. So you maintain an original cultural identity that includes food, clothing, oftentimes language, artistic styles, religion, philosophical beliefs, etc. So you maintain these even while you live in a new hegemonic culture where there's a different cultural norm around a lot of those ideas. The acculturation process often gives us the idea of cultural pluralism, the idea that you can actually have a society where multiple cultures are present at the same time and people can share and exchange ideas about their own culture. They can celebrate their own background while also celebrating the backgrounds of others, and everyone can live harmoniously in society where they have their own separate identities, but then they also share an overarching identity. This is sometimes also called multiculturalism or the multicultural perspective. So I want to talk briefly about the differences between internal cultural change and external cultural change. Of course, internal cultural change refers to changes that a society makes within itself, whereas external cultural changes are changes that are brought about for a society due to external influences. So as our textbook talks about, One of the early anthropological theories about internal cultural change was that of cultural evolution, or the idea that all societies started out at the same point and primitive cultures evolved into more complex, advanced cultures. Now, right off the bat, you should recognize that there are a lot of problems with this theory because we use the word primitive to begin with. This cultural evolution theory was based off of social Darwinism, a kind of survival of the fittest for culture, where some cultures won out over more primitive cultures. In other words, this was just justification for colonialism and racism and a bunch of other shitty things that we do not support as anthropologists anymore. And so, if all cultures adapt over time, all cultures in society have a cultural history. And this is an ongoing process. When cultural change is internal and the group of people themselves directs and defines their own cultural change, this process is known as ethnogenesis. In other words, the change that comes from people that originates somewhere, it originates from the people. It genesises from the ethno. Our text gives a couple of different examples of ethnogenesis that I just want to review so we can differentiate them. First of all, you have inventions. Inventions are totally new shit. That's when someone just creates something new. This can be a new technology, that's kind of the most obvious example of an invention, but it also can be a new idea, a new philosophy, a new political system, a new approach to nutrition, a new conceptualization about vaccines, a new way of thinking about climate change. Like all of these are inventions because they start out being completely new. But you can also have innovation. Innovation is a process where you already have some pre-existing idea or some pre-existing technology, and then you go and change it. You make it better. You upgrade it. Essentially, you innovate, right? Like that's why that word is so popular as a buzzword in marketing and business. But what innovating is taking pre-existing cultural knowledge and then bumping it up to the next level, adding something new to it, making it something even better. Now, if we take it up a notch from there, we also have the concept of revolution, where people actually demand massive social change, political change, economic change, religious, technological, etc. And so you see a dramatic shift in culture. This isn't always literally like an armed revolution or people protesting in the streets. As somebody who grew up in the 90s, when I look at the way that social media and digital technologies have changed our society just within my own lifetime, I mean, that's a social media revolution. We think about existence differently. That is a cultural revolution that has led to cultural change. Okay, so let's switch gears now and talk about external cultural change. And a lot of this comes, again, from cultural contact. This external change comes from diffusion, the spread of ideas through cultural contact, whether intentional or unintentional. So if you think, for example, the way that cuisines from different regions of the world have been spread throughout the entire globe, and now as an American, you can turn on your Grubhub and order from 20 different cuisines, right? That's part of cultural diffusion. A great deal of cultural diffusion occurred because of colonialism. Colonialism was, and to a certain extent still is, a process in which Western or dominant states basically owned other territories and ruled over them. And sometimes it went well, but most of the times it went really, really poorly. By the way, you'll also hear me use the term developing world a lot, or sometimes underdeveloped world. These are the countries, in many cases, that had a colonial experience and are still not as technologically or economically developed as their colonial counterparts. The amount of cultural change that has occurred because of colonialism cannot be denied. Don't worry, I'm going to do a whole set of lectures on colonialism, on post-colonialism, on the developing world and the underdeveloped world later this semester. Today, there's a far less influence from colonialism or post-colonialism and far more cultural diffusion influence coming from globalization. Globalization is a really broad term. It's used a lot in politics and political discourse and social discourse, but really globalization just means the spread of ideas around the globe. This can be economic, political, cultural, technological, ecological, etc. But the sharing of ideas from one group of people to another group of people across the planet. Now, one of the things that I've never understood, and I still don't entirely understand it, is why so many people talk about globalization like this is some kind of new thing. Like, we just invented globalization when we got the internet. That's ridiculous. For pretty much all of human civilized history, we have had global empires. They haven't always originated in the same place, and you don't always talk about them in all of your history classes, but there have been numerous examples of vast global empires that have exchanged ideas, that have exchanged culture, art, architecture, food, religion, language, politics, philosophy. All of these have been shared at a globalized level for millennia now. So this idea that globalization is somehow new and some kind of modern, new technological idea that we need to be concerned about, I mean, that's ridiculous. We've always been a globalized species. We've always been a unified humanity. So this is not new. We just have an easier time doing it now that we all have Facebook. In the end, all cultures change. Sometimes they change for the better, sometimes they change for the worse. But it is a continuous and dynamic process of ups and downs as part of the roller coaster of the human experience. And societies change because of their own internal dynamics, but also because of the external factors, the cultures around them that shift their own paradigms. We're going to continue to talk about this dynamic between internal change and external influence many times throughout this semester. All right, thanks so much for listening.